you all are finding your seat, I'm going to invite you to open to Nehemiah chapter 9. That's where we're going to be this morning. We're continuing our series through the book of Nehemiah entitled Election, Exodus, and Exile, all about the glory of God in the Old Testament. We've been using Nehemiah chapter 9 as a blueprint or an outline for us to look back at Israel's history as they are doing and to praise God's name for his faithfulness towards them and vicariously towards us as we look at it. Nehemiah chapter 9, we're going to be looking at verses 26 through 31 this morning. And it says, "But they became disobedient and rebelled against you and cast your law behind their backs and killed your prophets who had admonished them so that they might return to you. And they committed great blasphemies. Therefore, you delivered them into the hand of their oppressors who oppressed them. But when they cried to you in the time of their distress, you heard from heaven, and according to your great compassion, you gave them deliverers who delivered them from the hand of their oppressors. But as soon as they had rest, they did evil again before you. Therefore, you abandoned them to the hand of their enemies so that they ruled over them. When they cried again to you, you heard from heaven, and many times you rescued them according to your compassion and admonished them in order to turn them back to your law. Yet they acted arrogantly and did not listen to your commands, but sinned against your ordinances, by which, if a man observes them, he shall live. And they turned a stubborn shoulder and stiffened their necks and would not listen. However, you bore with them for many years and admonished them by your Spirit through your prophets, yet they would not give ear. Therefore, you gave them into the hand of the peoples of the land. Nevertheless, in your great compassion, you did not make an end of them or forsake them, for you are a gracious and compassionate God." The way that God deals with sin, which we just saw in this passage, the way that God deals with sin is that he punishes it. That's what God does. And I think that we have a tendency to forget this for good reason. I think we know so much about the cross. We know so much about Jesus and his sacrifice and what the cross means for us, that when we think about sin and we think about God, we are able to kind of leapfrog the gap in our thinking to saying, well, Jesus paid it all. And that's good. But I think we rob the cross of a little bit of its meaning if we leapfrog over the fact that God punishes sin. He hates it. His wrath burns against it, and he punishes sin. That's what God does. All the glories of God that we've seen in Nehemiah chapter 9, as we've been going through this, have been preparing us for this reality. If God is who we say he is, if he is singular, if he is holy, if he is all-powerful, if he is just, and if he is righteous, then we should not be surprised that the way God responds when his name is walked all over by his people is punishment. That should not catch anybody off guard. If what we know about God is true and what we see about how the Israelites treat the name of God is true, then God punishing sin makes total sense. And the form that takes in Israel's history, the way that we see it play out in the Old Testament, is their destruction from outside forces. So the title of today's message is, "You delivered them into the hand of their oppressors." That's what God's punishment on the people's sin looks like, them being handed over to oppression from other peoples. And we have to see that if we are going to be able to grasp the glory of God's grace, which is revealed in the three truths that are going to form the structure of the sermon this morning. Namely, you gave them deliverers, which we're going to see in verses 26 and 27. You heard from heaven, which we'll see in verses 28 and 29. And finally, you did not make an end of them, which we'll see in verses 30 through 31. This sermon is about judgment on sin, but it's also primarily over that about God's mercy and his steadfast love towards sinners. That's what we're looking at this morning. So I'm going to pray for us, and then we will get into it. Heavenly Father, Lord, I know and they know, we all know together that we are prone to wonder. We sang about it, and we see it in our own lives all the time. And what we're going to see in these passages today is that it is not unique to us. That all through human history, reaching back thousands of years, even to your people, the Hebrews, we are prone to wonder. And the only hope that we wanderers have is that you are steadfast, that you never wander, you never stray. You are our bulwark of confidence, our Ebenezer, as the song says. Lord, I pray that that would be evident as we look at your word this morning. Pray that we'd be equipped by it and encouraged. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So the first point we're going to see here, verses 26 and 27, is you gave them deliverers. Verse 26 says, they became disobedient and rebelled against you and cast your law behind their backs and killed your prophets who had admonished them so that they might return to you. And they committed great blasphemies. Now, if you've been keeping up with the Nehemiah chapter 9, our series, or if you've ever spent any time really looking at the Old Testament, you would read this and you would say, oh, Israel's at it again. This seems to always be happening for them, that they are rebelling against God, they're getting arrogant towards God. Justin brought the message last week where he talked about how thoroughly God cared for and provided for the Israelites. If you weren't here for that message, it's available on YouTube, but Justin said God is doing all these things, a lot of things. Everything that the Israelites could have wanted, God was providing for it, and with no reciprocation from the Israelites. And that's terrible. We think about our own personal experience, just between human to human. Lack of reciprocation is offensive, isn't it? If I hold the door open for somebody and they pass on through without saying thank you, well, that's not nice, Or if we expand it a little bit, it was somebody standing in the middle of the road and they don't see a bus coming at them, and I leap out and I grab them and save them from getting run over by the bus. And there's no sense of thankfulness even in that situation. That's wild. That doesn't make any sense. Everybody would say that's not right. We can multiply that by an infinite amount to try to understand the relationship between the Israelites and God at this juncture here in verse 26. Because God has done so much more than just hold the door open for the Israelites. He's saved them from slavery. He has given his spirit to lead them. He's given them food from heaven, water from a rock. He's giving them direction through the wilderness, a promised land that they are being brought into. He's given them everything, and they're receiving all of it, but they do not reciprocate. And honestly, they're doing worse than just not reciprocating. They are blaspheming God's name. If I hold the door open for somebody and they walk through without saying thank you, that's not cool. But if I hold the door open for somebody and they walk through, and as they're walking through, they say, you're ugly and your breath stinks, and then go on in, well, that's just wrong, Or I save somebody from the bus scenario, and they say, ugh, I would rather be hit by a bus than have to be touched by somebody with your BO. That is, I think this is a universal truth that's wrong. That whatever culture, whatever economic level, people would look at that and say, not good to respond that way when somebody has done something like save your life. I think we're all on the same page with that. But to an infinitely despicable degree, that's what the Israelites are doing to God. Not simply just not reciprocating, they are rebelling against God, blaspheming his name. The text says that they became disobedient, rebelled, and cast your law behind their backs. That good and just and truthful and wonderful law that God came down on Mount Sinai to give to his people, the Israelites, they're done with all of that. They put it behind their backs. God is waiting on them day in and day out, taking care of their every need, but they are rejecting his law. This is a poisonous relationship that God is in with his people, because they're reveling in the good gifts of God. That's the word that was used in the text that Justin brought last week. They are reveling in God's good gifts, but they do not care to listen to his instruction. They love all the stuff they're getting from God, but they could not care to listen to his instruction, his ordinances, and his laws. They cast all that behind their back, straight over their shoulder. That's what's going on in verse 26. This is not, I want to make this clear, this is not simply just making a mistake. That's a completely different stuff. These people aren't just bad at obeying God. They are intentionally rejecting obeying God. They are stiff-arming the law of God. So this isn't, they're trying really hard and they're just failing at it. That's a completely different thing, isn't it? That's a completely different scenario. There's a huge difference between wanting to do right and falling short and saying, I am not interested in what God calls right and wrong. Big difference there. And the Israelites are falling in that second category. They don't care about God's law. They know it. They have it. They know it. And they're rejecting it. They knew what God had called them to be, and they are crossing their arms, shaking their heads, and saying, we're not going to do that. And I think we see this in our culture more than almost anywhere else in the world, because we Americans are weirdly biblically literate compared to most of the globe. And we are also simultaneously grossly unbiblical in our thinking and in our politics and in our actions. It's a strange juxtaposition. I was having a conversation with a guy this week, and he said something. I won't go into all the details. We were just having a conversation. It was after church last Sunday. We were in Tennessee, and he said something that sounded great, and it sounded very biblical and sounded very spiritual. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, like, even though he's using the right words, what he's saying is very unbiblical. And I think that seems to be the tendency of Americans. You know, like, I think we have enough of the information of God's teaching in the Bible to use those words and use that language and twist it to either reject it or say that it's wrong, or to leverage it to our own advantage. Has that been y'all's experience? I feel like when I think about the Israelites, it's not that they were uninformed. They had the law, and it says they cast it behind their backs. And I think that's what we deal with on a daily basis, even in the so-called church. People casting the law behind their backs. The text says they didn't like it when God sent people to point that out. The rest of verse 26 says, they cast your law behind their backs and killed your prophets who had admonished them so that they might return to you. So this is another step away. Not only do they have the law, but they're rejecting it, they are also violent towards God's instruction through the prophets to try to get them to come back. So the people, they're receiving all the good gifts from God, they're liking it, but they don't want to listen to God's command, and then God sends prophets to say, hey, y'all should listen to God's commands. And the people kill them. They get the axe. This is a long-suffering God. The people have rejected him, and he sends proxies, people with his words, with his authority, to the people to stand in front of them and say, return to the Lord. What you're doing is wrong. And the people kill them. They blaspheme God's name by rejecting his law and killing his prophets. So let's just ask the question, what should God do in this situation? What is the answer after that? It isn't more gifts. If they're not listening to the prophets, what is the answer? And verse 27 tells us, therefore, you delivered them into the hand of their oppressors who oppressed them. Of course he did. What else was God going to do in this situation? God's whole system that he set up was, I will be your God. I will give you food, water, land, security. I'll give you an identity. And all you have to do is obey my commands and live and love and thrive in all of the provision that I'm giving you. So if the people aren't doing that, then what's the result? The people lose all the other stuff. It's the exact same system that we see all the way back in the Garden of Eden. From the very beginning, that's how God has established his relationship with his people. I will give you land. I will give you security. I will give you an identity. I will give you commands, and all you have to do is obey and love, live and thrive in the world that I am giving you to the glory of my name. God is the good gift giver, and we then are the glory givers for his good gifts. So when the people stop being glory givers for God's gifts, God stops giving good gifts. The people have rejected God's law. They spurn him. So God then withdraws. He redacts their identity in his name, and they are handed over to the people. The word in verse 27, that word therefore, shows that there is a cause and effect between verse 26 and verse 27. You profane the name of God, you cast his law behind your back, therefore God hands them over to their oppressors, withdraws his protection, withdraws his provision, and withdraws their identity as his people. Now there's somebody else's people. Somebody else has come in and is calling the shots. So they were handed over to their oppressors, but back in verse 27, but when they cried out to you in their time of distress, let's just wait right there. There's a comma there, so let's take a pause and make sure that we are steeped in the anticipation of this moment, because we know how the Israelites have been behaving. We know how God has responded. It says, but when they, but when they cried out to you in their time of distress, what does it say? You heard from heaven. God handed them over to their oppressors, but he didn't leave them. When it came down to it, they cried out for help. God delivered them. He heard from heaven. And I love the symmetry between these two verses. You see that the people rejected God, and when he sent people to, I'll use the word deliver them from their sin, when he sent prophets to put them back on track, they killed them. So then God, what? He rejects them, sends them over to their oppressors, but when they cry out, he does the exact same thing. He sends deliverers for them. And I imagine we know from the history of Israel that they were all too happy to receive those deliverers that brought life for them. God punishes sin, but when the people cried out, he heard from heaven and he sent deliverers. That's great. Before we move on to the next point, I want to plug in some application for us here. First, I want to say that the people willfully rebelled against God's law, and he didn't abandon them. Punish them? Yes. Abandon them? No. So what that means for us is if you're a Christian, and if you are, by the grace of Jesus, trying to live the Christian life, God's not going to abandon you. If he didn't abandon the arrogant Israelites when they cast the law behind their backs, he's not going to abandon the blood-soaked Christians who are living a life of faith, even when we fail. He stuck by them, so we can say that he stuck by us. And the reason is that he got out in front of it. Before you ever had a chance to rebel against God's law, he had already sent the deliverer for you. That's what we should see whenever we look at the cross of Jesus Christ. We should see that I have been delivered from the hand of my oppressor. We give God glory for that. In a more perfect world, I think we could end the sermon right there. That we could we could look at the cross of Jesus, and we could say, I've been delivered from the hand of my oppressor, and we could all feel good about that and glorify God for his goodness and walk out of here smiling. But human history and our own experience and verse 28 keeps us from doing that. We have to stay in the conversation a little bit longer because verse 28 starts with, but. Verse 27 was not the end of the story as it probably should have been. Verse 28 says, but as soon as they had rest, they did evil again before you. That word rest in that verse, this is probably just me, but that word rest is like a lightning bolt to my mind. It's like a vacuum that pulls all of my attention to it as soon as they had rest. And I think we have enough evidence. You see that phrase, as soon as they had rest, they did evil again before you. I think we have enough evidence from pop culture and from our experience and from history to make a sweeping general statement about the human experience. And that is, rest creates weakness. That when things get easy, people get lazy. That's what I see here in verse 28. It reminds me of the saying, y'all have probably heard it, I don't remember exactly how it goes, but the saying that hard times create strong men and easy times create what? Weak men. It reminds me more of what Bane told Batman when he was fighting him in The Dark Knight Rises. Right before he lays the smackdown on him, Bane says, peace has cost you your strength. And then he breaks his back. And I think that we see that in the world. I don't think that this is unique to any people groups, that ease creates laziness. I was listening to a seminar on manhood on Right Now Media, and the guy that was leading that, he made a joke that I thought was right on. I don't know how seriously he meant this, but he said that men don't die of old age, they die of retirement. He said that when men stop working, they stop living. And I thought that was excellent because I think ease creates laziness. So now I read this, I see myself and all people in that truth. They had rest, and then they did evil again before you. Now, to be clear, there is good rest and there's bad rest. We can assume from the text that this was bad rest that we're talking about here because there is good rest. Another reason that I think that word rest kind of jumps at my face when I see it is because just a few verses ago in Nehemiah chapter 9, we see that God, in handing down his law, also introduced the Israelites to the Sabbath, which was a God-designed, God-ordained, from Genesis chapter 1, rest for his people. So I don't think we can say that rest is the enemy here. God rested. You read the Bible, God rested, and he told his people to rest. Work for 6 days, rest on the seventh. Work in time, rest in eternity. That's how God has set up the system. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 11 calls us to be diligent, that we may enter the rest of the Lord. And Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, Jesus said what? Come to me, all who are weary, and I'll give you rest. Rest is not the enemy here. The issue is how they rest. In what way do they rest? That's really the problem. There's a good kind of rest and there's a bad kind of rest. God didn't establish his Sabbath so that his people could soothe their aching nerves with watching football or getting their grocery shopping out of the way for the week. That is not what the Sabbath was designed for. That's not the good kind of rest. If the Israelites had been resting in the Lord, I don't think the result would have been evil again before him. So they're missing the value of rest, which is in what they find rest. So let me just say, I don't want you to read this. Modern, academic, career-driven, busy parents and grandparents and taking care of your aging parents, Christians, you need to rest. And there is a good way to do it. The way this plays out in my life, I'll give you a little example. When I've had a long day, the boys have been a handful, finally get them into bed, and I get that moment to be able to take a breath and relax for a minute. Let's say I have two options in front of me. I get my mug of decaf wild berry tea. I'm sitting there and I have two options. Either I could sit down on the couch with my wife and we could talk about our days and spend those moments together, or I could turn on an episode of my favorite show at the moment. Both relaxing opportunities. Both would fulfill the role of helping me decompress from the day. But is one of those options intrinsically more valuable than the other? Is one of those options more real and lasting and important than the other? Even though they both might accomplish the same end, one of those is a better option for my rest. And it's the same way with our relationship with God. If our resting or recharging never has anything to do with God, if it's never experienced in the context of reading the Bible or praying to God or singing or meditating with God in mind, then that's not real or lasting or valuable. It might be restful, which I could argue, but it's not real rest. It's not what we're talking about when we mention the Sabbath. So there's good, God-given rest, and then there's selfish, me taking from myself rest. And based on the context, the Israelites are doing the second. So what happens? Tells us again, God gave them over to their enemies. Again, they cried out. And again, God heard from heaven. Verse 29, picking up there. You rescued them according to your compassion and admonished them in order to turn them back to your law. God's rescuing brings with it admonishment, admonition, and instruction. Hebrews 12 describes God as a loving father who disciplines his children, and that's what we see going on here at the beginning of verse 29, admonishing them to return back to his law. Dads, we have to do this all the time, instructing, punishing, comforting, and teaching. It's a cycle of punishing what's wrong, tenderly caring for the hurt feelings after the punishment, and then instructing to get past the thing that caused this diversion in the first place. Firm, tender, and teaching. The cycle of the Father, and that's how our Father deals with us, rescues and instructs. The word is admonishes. Yet they acted arrogantly and did not listen, but sinned against your ordinances, by which, catch this, if a man observes them, he will live. The ordinances of God are life in this context. Just the way that Psalm chapter 1, verses 2 and 3 describe water to a tree are the ordinances of God for his people. Psalm chapter 1, verses 2 and 3 says, his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. In doing that, he will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season. So in that analogy, we are the tree, and the streams of water, the life-giving water, are the law of the Lord, the ordinances of God, by which if a man follows them, he shall live. So if this is life for the people, why are they stiffening their necks against it? Why? Wretched people that we are, why? It's like It's like a fool who rejects life-giving medicine because they don't like the taste of it. This isn't simply just a system of thinking that we have here. This isn't simply our brand of philosophy. And it's not to be boiled down to evidences which, when proven, must be upheld as truth. The ordinances of God are life. To be separated from them is to be a tree plucked out of the ground. People stiffen their necks against it, but in all of that, our final movement, verses 30 and 31, God did not make an end of them. However, you bore with them for many years and admonished them by your Spirit through your prophets, yet they would not give ear. Therefore you gave them into the hand of the peoples of the lands. Nevertheless, in your great compassion, you did not make an end of them or forsake them. For you are a gracious and compassionate God. In all of that we're talking about, we've talked about a lot already that the Israelites have done, but in all of it, says you bore with them. God bore with them. He bears with us for years, many, many years. He gave his Spirit to admonish them. He sent the prophets to talk to them and lead them. And it says, of course, I don't think any of us are surprised by this, verse 30, yet they would not give ear. And it's almost too much to watch. It's redundant to see over and over again God saving his people and to see over and over again his people rebelling against him. To see over and over again that he sends his Spirit and his prophets, and he has his law there to guide the people, and over again the people will not give ear to it. God didn't listen, they didn't listen, and God gave them into the hand of the peoples of the land. And I think that we should take a pause. This might be, this might be the most important part of the sermon. When you read this, I think that we should feel in this repetition that we're seeing here, I think that we should feel the ebb and the flow of what it means to follow God. I think that we should see it. I don't know one single Christian who would say that following God is easy all the time. Not say it and mean it. It wasn't the case for the Israelites, obviously. We just watched that spiral for the last few verses. It wasn't true for David. David's called the king after God's own heart. But David was not always on point. And that's a little bit of an understatement. Wasn't true for Peter. He's the rock of the church. And you read the Gospels, and Peter, it seems like, got just as many things wrong as he did right. And it wasn't true for Paul, the author of the New Testament. He says in Romans chapter 7, wretched man that I am, contending always with his flesh. And that's how it should be. The moment that we begin to walk in our own strength, the moment that we feel our feet under us, and we get to stand up a little bit straighter, walking in our own strength, feeling that we have done away with sin, that it's somehow behind us. When that happens, we are severed from the grace of Jesus Christ. That's what Paul is talking about in Galatians chapter 5, verse 4, when he says, you have been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by the law. You've fallen from grace, is what he says. And what he's talking about there are people who are afraid of that ebb and flow. People who are afraid of this terrible cycle that we see here in Israel's history. What he's talking about are people who are posturing themselves as if they can make it on their own. That's what the law became for these people that Paul is talking about in Galatians. That they are using the law to basically exempt them from sin. But in doing that, we sever ourselves from the grace of Christ. The ups and the downs that we feel in our spiritual journeys are not just nuisances to be dealt with in salvation. They are salvation. That is where the strength of Christ is revealed in our lives, is whenever we stumble and fall. When that happens for you, Christian, say good. Call it good, and then memorize why it's good, which is 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, which says, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, which says, my grace is sufficient for you, and my strength is made perfect in weakness. Don't be afraid of those ups and downs. When you slip and fall, say good. Because there for a minute, I thought I was doing this thing on my own. And Jesus will step in. Everything that we're talking about here, I'll say this in closing, everything that we're talking about here in Nehemiah chapter 9 is more about God than it is about us. We have to remember that. This is so that God's name will be praised, not mainly so that our feelings will be helped, so that God's name will be praised. Look at the last part of verse 31 here. Look at the last part, verse 31. Nevertheless, in your great compassion, you did not make an end of them or forsake them. For you are a gracious and compassionate God. All of that punishing, all of the back and forth that we just saw in these verses, all of that, what I'm calling the ebb and flow, all of that is revealing the grace of God in our lives. Because in all of it, he does not make an end of the people. He does not forsake them. That's true for them, and it's true for us. At no point did God sever ties with Israel and say, I'm done with this people. I'm going to go start over with someone else. At no point did God say, you know what, that's enough. We need another flood and destroy the planet again. In all of the punishing and all of the returning and all the blaspheming that he had to endure, his grace shone through in the fact that he did not make an end of them and he did not forsake them. And he actually did much more than that. Not only did he not forsake them, not only did he not make an end for them, but he sent his son to die for them and to die for us. Romans chapter 3, verses 25 through 26. This is a good one to have in your tool belt whenever you're looking at the Old Testament. Because what it reveals for us is that Jesus was not just Matthew chapter 1 and on in human history. Jesus works retroactively throughout all of human history to secure the grace of God for his people today, back then, 6,000 years ago. Romans chapter 3, verses 25 through 26 says, whom God displayed publicly as a propitiation in his blood through faith. This was to demonstrate his righteousness, because in the forbearance of God, he passed over the sins previously committed. For the demonstration, I say, of his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be just and justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. What that means is that every time you read something in the Old Testament, like what we just read, where you see the people sinning and God not burning them up with his wrathful fire, you should remember that the only reason that God is able to do that, the why and the how of a righteous God not putting an end to sin, the only answer the Bible gives from start to finish is Jesus Christ. so that God would be revealed as both just and justifier. So when we think about our lives, this cycle that we find ourselves stuck in, we look at the cross. I want to encourage you, I'm not saying don't try. I'm not saying that we throw up our hands and say, well, this is just how things are. I'm just a sinful person. No, Paul said, I beat against my flesh. He said that run the race was the analogy that he liked to use. He said, fight the good fight. Get in there and fight, but just remember that when you get knocked down, and it happens, for the Israelites, it was from generation to generation. For us, it's what? Week to week, day to day. Whenever you fail, just know that God isn't standing over on the sidelines, crossing his arms saying, you quitter. He's saying, no, my strength is made perfect in your weakness. And then we continue to fight. So Stan and Amy are going to come back up. They're going to lead us in a closing song, and I want to encourage you all to reflect on this. Do whatever you need to do to cement in your mind the truth that, yes, we fight against our flesh. Yes, we reject our sin, and we get after it every day, but we do it all under the umbrella of the grace of Christ, so that when we fail, we don't run away and hide in the corner. We don't go get up under the bushes because we hear the sound of God approaching. We run to him to restore us.